Hello, I'm Abram Benningen.
And I'm Joanne Diaz.
And this is Poetry for All.
We had such a good time talking with Luke Bender about Du Fu's great poem, Facing Snow, that we wanted to add a second part in which Luke is going to guide us through a second poem by Du Fu titled Passing the Night by White Sands Post Station. So, Luke, thank you again for joining us to discuss this second poem.
Thank you for having me back.
And would you be willing to read that poem again in the Chinese and English?
Sure. So the Chinese title is 素白沙羿水苏任由照人言复此庭一边沙九百户外草新青万象皆春气古差自可兴虽薄无仙月地地尽难明 So the English title is Passing the Night by White Sands Post Station. Though I'll sleep on the water, there's still some lingering sunlight, smoke of human habitation, and then this pavilion. Alongside the post station, the sands, they're old white. Beyond the lake, the grass is newly green. The myriad images all have the air of spring. This solitary raft is alone a traveling star. Yet following the waves, there's no end to the moonlight. Clearly, I draw near the southern deeps.
So, Luke, we've looked at Facing Snow, which is, as you say, one of the most famous poems and one still memorized today. And that catches him right at the beginning of the Civil War. And then you've also given us this poem to look at and to listen to from later in his life.
So this poem is written in the very last year of Du Fu's life, and he has spent the last decade drifting about far away from his homeland on the margins of the Chinese Empire, the now ruined Chinese Empire. And here he finds himself quite old, very sick. He's got diabetes. He's largely blind. He's mostly deaf. He's sort of ostensibly headed home, although it's not clear that he ever really thought he would make it there. So he's traveling along the Yangtze River and through some of the kind of storied, beautiful landscapes of the Southlands in China that he's read about but never been able to visit. And he's writing poetry at this point in his life with the awareness that all of his youthful ambitions have not come true. He will never be a high government official. With the awareness that it's very likely his poetry will never be particularly appreciated. I mean, he wasn't famous in his lifetime. He doesn't become the greatest poet in Chinese history until several hundred years later. And he's trying to kind of figure out, well, how do I make sense of a life that by all standard ways of thinking about what a good life is doesn't look like a good life. It looks like a kind of a life that went awry, that went off the rails, that failed. And so this poem is one of a number of, I think, quite beautiful regulated verses that he writes in his old age style. And I think what he's trying to do here is to talk about how poetry can make meaning or discover meaning in a life that may not seem on our, what we inherit as the categories of what a good, moral, successful life looks like.
That's quite beautiful, and I'm wondering if you could point us to maybe one or two places in the poem where you see that particularly happening.
So one of the things that Du Fu does in some of these very late regulated verses is he's playing with ambiguities to create the possibility that the poem can be read more than one way. And this poem, that happens in the final line. The phrase that I translate is clearly, in Chinese, it's DD, and that can have two meanings. One of them is a description of the scene. So he's out on the water on this vast Yangtze River, and it's this beautiful moonlit night. And so the water is sparkling. It's DD, as in it's bright, it's luminous. But the word DD can also mean obviously or clearly. And here we need to know the allusion in the phrase southern deeps. So on the one hand, the word southern deeps can just mean, deep water in the south. And it's true. It is very clear. Du Fu is approaching deep water in the south. He's on the Yangtze River in the south of China. But there's also a mythical allusion to a story in which the phrase Nanming, southern deeps, is the pool of heaven.
Oh.
So Du Fu is seeing the waters filled with moonlight. He's recalling stories of people who ride the Yangtze. And in Chinese mythology, if you ride the Yangtze all the way out into the ocean, eventually you sail up into the River of Stars, which is the Milky Way. And you can sail all the way back around and come down. So there's this water cycle. And so he's saying, clearly, I'm approaching the southern deeps. And that's literally true. He's literally approaching deep water in the south. But because of the ambiguity in the phrase DD, I must be approaching heaven.
Yeah.
It's also a description of the luminousness of the scene. This depiction, I must be getting close to heaven.
This is amazing. What a beautiful, and thank you for explaining that, because now, as I heard you talking, I was reading through the poem again, and even as you say, biographically, he is at the end of his life. He is sort of foreseeing his afterlife, right? Even so, I love the way he still peppers this small poem with all kinds of renewal and possibility, right? So even if it is a poem of disappointment, of anticipating his death, there's still some lingering sunlight. Beyond the lake, the grass is newly green. The myriad images all have the air of spring. And then, as you say, that third to last line, this solitary raft is alone a traveling star. That's my favorite line of the poem. It's so beautiful and strange.
Everything you said is really perceptive and just right on about this poem. So, one of the things that I find really compelling in Du Fu is that he is a poet who is writing in a situation that I feel resonates with ours, in that he lives at a period where certain kinds of assumptions about what matters and what's good and what's important and how we have a society, what kind of society we should have, are breaking down. He lived in a society that thought it had everything figured out, and then it collapses suddenly, completely, to this civil war. And what a lot of his poetry is doing is trying to think about, well, if I don't have these inherited assumptions about value, about beauty, about meaning, how do I make sense of my life? How do I come up with new ways of seeing the world? What resources do I have to draw upon? The previous poem, Facing Snow, is him in the process of coming to question everything that he had taken for granted. And this poem at the end of his life is where he ends up, which is, I don't know what's going to happen in the future. So you notice that there's all this kind of new growth, new birth, lingering sunlight, the air of spring. He's aware, I think, at the end of his life, that he's in no position to judge whether his life has been a failure or a success.
Oh.
There's always new possibilities. And so when he writes these late poems in which he's building in multiple possibilities for interpretation, what I think he's doing is he's leaving an openness for people to come along and see kinds of meaning in his life that he doesn't see, to find significance or value that he, in his sort of limited context, within his limited horizons, may not be able to perceive. So the late poetry of Du Fu in a lot of ways becomes opening up his experience to multiple perspectives, multiple kinds of interpretations, to see, this is literally what's happening, but maybe this is also happening. Maybe this is also happening.
Yeah, this is so nice, because very early on when we first started doing this podcast, I'll never forget, we discussed a poem by Phyllis Wheatley, and Abram said something that was so insightful. He said, what if Phyllis Wheatley is writing to an audience that does not yet exist? What if she is anticipating a readership that might understand the layers of irony embedded in that particular poem? And so as I hear you talking now, I'm thinking, there's that active imagination again, where someone like Du Fu, he's living in, to say the least, based on what you've described, a highly imperfect world, a fallen world, right? A chaotic, disrupted world. And what if he's anticipating a world, perhaps centuries later, where his work would be celebrated? And of course, now it is. It's just magnificent.
Joanne, you mentioned he's imagining this readership that might come along in the future. And, well, spoiler alert, it comes along. And so one of the questions that you provided was, how does Du Fu stand out from the other poets of his age?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, as you said, Joanne, Du Fu, I think, really is writing for an audience that isn't right there. Towards the end of his life, he basically has no one to write for. He's living way out of the elite centers of the empire. He's obviously doing something with the art that is very different from what people were expected to do with the poetic art at this time. Since it was such a social art, you were writing within a community, you were writing for other people, you were writing in social occasions most of the time. Du Fu is totally divorced from this world. And so he's writing a poetry that is profoundly strange for his age. In fact, some of it is very difficult to understand because he's writing really for himself, so he can play with all sorts of words, and Chinese poetry is highly telegraphic. You take out all of the connective tissue and you kind of just put in, the nouns and like one or two adjectives. And then the reader has to build the poem out of these sort of building blocks that are prepared by the poet. So this leaves a lot of room for audience participation in Chinese poetry. Now, Du Fu's period, as I said, is looked back on as this kind of great flourishing of Chinese poetry, but part of that is due to Du Fu. And part of it is because Du Fu is writing in this new way that demands new kinds of participation. His poetry is actually capable of transforming over time. So as the assumptions and the values of readers change, the fact that Du Fu is doing something weird and strange and not predictable and not sort of bound to the assumptions of his period means that it's got a space for participation from all of these subsequent generations who have seen in it different values over time. And Du Fu, even in the modern period, Du Fu was the poet who sort of survived even the Cultural Revolution. When the whole Confucian pre-modern culture, it gets repudiated, but Du Fu still remains a kind of hero because he can be read as a, in that case, a proto-Marxist, somebody who really cared about the people. Before that, wow, he was the poet of exemplary loyalty to the emperor. So quite the opposite of a proto-Marxist.
That is awesome. That is so awesome. And, hearing you talk reminds me that at any point, humans who read this poem are going to be able to attach themselves and their particular cultural moment or political strife to some of what he's tapping into, right? And so to imagine what true exile must have felt like, or true imprisonment or banishment or whatever, it's a state of despair that for it to resonate over the centuries is really something.
Du Fu's life could not have been the success it ultimately is if it hadn't been the profound failure that it was.
Yeah.
There's a connection between not being appreciated in your time and then being able to be appreciated in later times, right? And there's a way in which that not being appreciated in your time is something that can translate to any time in the future. There will always be people in exile, spiritually, physically. There's definitely a sense in which if Du Fu had succeeded and he'd become a great administrator in the state, he just wouldn't have written the kind of interesting poetry that he did. He wouldn't have been prompted to try and think about, well, how can my life be understood differently? He wouldn't have been invested as he became in ambiguities, in ironies, in, the ability of a poem to say multiple things to different people. We often invest heavily, and we should, in the things that we believe are good and valuable and right. But we should also bear in mind that will change over time, that our values are relative. They are of our moment, and we should, do what we think is right and be invested in them, but also have a certain flexibility to realize that we don't see the full picture. Yeah. What I think Du Fu cultivates towards the end of his life is a virtue, how to live amidst this sort of change, how to enable yourself to transform. And this transformativity is a long-standing ideal of the Chinese tradition. So, the Taoist immortals, that's the thing that they're trying to be able to attain, is transformativity, the ability to change as the world changes and not to be stuck as one thing when the world inevitably, as it always does, continues to transform.
That's so beautiful. Thank you so much for guiding us through that poem. With all we've learned about Du Fu's Passing the Night by White Sands Post Station, would you be willing to read it again in both the Chinese and the English?
Sure. Du Fu, 素白沙缨，岁宿任幽照，人言复此庭。一边沙洲白，户外草新晴。万象皆春气，古钗自可兴。岁薄无闲月，地地尽难明。Du Fu, Passing the Night by White Sands Post Station. Though I'll sleep on the water, there's still some lingering sunlight, smoke of human habitation, and then this pavilion. Alongside the post station, the sands, they're old white. Beyond the lake, the grass is newly green. The myriad images all have the air of spring. This solitary raft is alone a traveling star. Yet following the waves, there's no end to the moonlight. Clearly I draw near the southern deeps.
Wow, that's great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Joanne and Abram. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, Luke, for joining us and for guiding us through that beautiful poem. To learn more about Du Fu, you can visit our website. You can find Lucas Bender's book and descriptions of his work online at his personal website. There are helpful descriptions of his publication that give further context and background for Du Fu's poetry.
Please remember to subscribe to Poetry for All wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.